clearly the agenda has changed, or the direction of the ship has changed, and especially in broadband.
So, do you think it has anything to do with the fact that the Biden administration's leading economists are actually law professors?
It doesn't give me very much confidence, right? Mm-hmm. And so even, with the broadband, the major piece that was put with broadband is this, convergence in a case for broadband rate regulation by Tejas Nurinciana, who I'd never really heard about before. I mean, I'm not really in, I follow some of the space when it comes to the legal side of telecom and broadband and all of that, but I'm far more focused on the econ side of things. And so
I think he actually clerked for Justice Breyer.
Okay. Well, that paper is a doozy.
Tell me about it.
So, I let me say,
let me just connect the dots here.
Yeah, of course.
So the executive order on competition, had a broadband section, and then there was a fact sheet.
Yep.
For the executive order, they also had a broadband or telecom broadband section. I forget what they called it. Made the claim that broadband markets that are served by one and only one supplier, which they call monopoly markets, which are always going to be rural, charge 5 times as much as competitive markets do.
Yeah.
And so this is what you're talking about, right?
Yes, this is the paper, right? Mm-hmm. So then I went through the paper just looking to see I went through
it's an unpublished paper, by the way.
It's a draft. Yes. It's a draft from earlier this year in April. So first and foremost, I don't know, maybe you learned this in school, but I was taught, thankfully, how to read something quickly. Right. And not to say I spent some time reading through this piece when it first came out, but typically, you look at the introduction, you look at the structure of the paper itself, and then I typically will go to the appendices and figure out like either the model or some of the other things that are connected there. And so there's a kind of a way and typically a structure when you look through these papers to get a good sense of it very, very quickly, like where you need to focus as you're reading through it your first time. So I did that, and it was noticeably absent that there's no model, really. There's no regression, right? There's no form model. There's no regression. And then when I started looking through to understand it and started reading through it, it really is kind of to be honest, it's a hodgepodge of different ideas all combined. And it doesn't even respond. I mean, what really angered me about this is there has been some really, really good work that's been done in this space. So the basics of the argument, it's, it's structured into 3 different sections, but the real meat comes in this second section. And so the first part talks about this problem that Charter's having, and it's trying to understand what competition looks like. Charter being a cable provider. And effectively what the paper says that Charter retains a monopoly control over local communications facilities, and that it holds significant power to charge super competitive rates for internet access service, and thereby also avoid competition to its cable service. And just first and foremost, I mean, there's like so many problems with that. One, I never at once saw the traditional things that you would understand and look for. So MVPD, right? Your the typical name that you are giving each one of these like the different services themselves. So that's not really there. The bias service isn't there as either. But more importantly, the way that this is understood and that this paper is understood is that competitive rates, that a cable provider will keep higher rates for internet access service, and that's going to avoid competition in the cable service. But that only could happen if the two are connected, right? If a consumer bundles both of them, then that's a possibility. But if you consume just purely internet service, right? I don't watch sports. I'm not really, I enjoy them, but I don't watch sports. I don't, subscribe to ESPN. I'm going to demand only an internet service or internet access service. And it doesn't really matter what the cable service looks like to me. And so they're already just like thinking through this. The problem is evidently clear that one, there's going to be at least 2 different types of consumers. One, right? One that consumes the service or both of these services, the cable service and then the internet access service. And then another set of competitor or another set of smaller consumers who are going to want a different service. And it's the bundle of those 2 together that are going to determine what a internet service provider and how they're going to price at different levels. So there is a paper that's all about this, April 2020, McManus et al., right? This is kind of in like the econ space and telecom. This is kind of what you need to respond to. It's this paper that asks this exact same question and comes to the exact opposite conclusion as this paper that came out earlier this year. So to me, it's like, well, wait a second, you're not even responding to the single most important paper that deals with this question. So that's a big problem. You don't have a model, so you can't even make proclamations about the world anyway. And even furthermore, the fundamental, even if you could do all of those things, right? And we just published some work on this as well. And we're very, very, very clear, even with working on this, even with working with data and using data correctly, we're very, very clear about how far the statements that we can make about the world are, because there's even a further problem for economists when it comes to this issue of causal inference, because fundamentally a lot of models and a lot of the way that most models are formed for this space in particular is that what we end up basically finding is we might end up picking up this different types of decisions, right? So sometimes the results that we're going to be getting basically are market entry decisions instead of market entry effects. And the way to think about that, it's like, well, why does a monopoly exist or tend to exist in rural areas? Well, because rural areas can't support anything else other than a monopoly, right? They can support one service, which is a monopoly.
And many of them can't even support one.
Yes, and indeed, a whole bunch of them. There's about 2% of all sites in the United States that won't even be able to support one, even with CapEx.
And there's a lot of people in those rural areas that actually could subscribe to a plan but don't, because it just, that's the low-hanging fruit for if you're a rural provider, is that you go out and try to get people to subscribe that never have.
Yeah. So all of these things just, I don't know, I'm working on a slightly separate section of the EO as well, which is on killer acquisitions. That to me is also another big, there's a study that they reference within the fact sheet when it came to killer acquisitions. And that is also a very limited study. It's much better. I mean, it actually is it's a good, solid empirical economist take on this issue of killer acquisitions, but it's only focused on, the pharmaceutical industry. And so you really can't say anything too much about big tech. And yet those sorts of expansions beyond what we can say and what the scope of knowledge really is that really worries me,
Well, I mean, going back to the Narachania paper, his claim is that rural prices the prices aren't really higher. What he actually said was speeds are lower. And so people kind of pay the same thing for a broadband plan in rural America that they do in urban America. They just don't get as much for it. So instead of getting, on average, the sort of average download speed, I guess, across the U.S. is around 100 megabits per second. And in rural America, it's probably, I don't know what the average is. It's probably closer to, somewhere between 5 and 20. And some of that depends on how you define rural. So they're not getting as much for their money. They're not actually writing bigger checks. And so his prescription for that is rate regulation. And so, but if the problem with monopolies is you don't have enough competition in a market, rate regulation doesn't really address that problem, right? I mean, because if you have a sole supplier and they're overpricing their product, well, number one, they're leaving a lot of people out. They're leaving a lot of customers, potential customers, unserved, so they're not collecting any money from them. But they're also inviting competitors into the market, right? I mean, this was what happened during the era when IBM was dominant in mainframe computers. Their prices were so high that they were practically inviting people to come under the umbrella and undercut their prices, and and a whole industry was really happy to do that, and ultimately
limit prices. So economists call these limit prices. Limit price is the limit, the highest amount that you can charge something without bringing entry into the market.
Yeah,
but more importantly, just as important with this question that this paper's getting at. Competition just doesn't happen on price, right? It happens on a price quality mix. And so if you keep the price the same, but you're getting different quality operation, that's a different sort of competition, right? It's generally what we call a Cournot competition, that what we actually care about is the amount of output that a structure is yielding instead of price. So price is a different sort of competition. If you're trying to change the price, so basically what he's saying is that prices are effectively the same everywhere, but what's different is the quality is effectively lower in rural America as compared to urban America, which means that fundamentally you like that to me is actually a very interesting sort of result. One, it's like if you find that means that there's something else that's going on here, right? That what's actually happening then is you're competing on a different sort of level than price. And if you're competing on a quality level, then your rate regulation doesn't really solve that issue, right? And this has been known for generations, in fact. Well, I shouldn't say generations. It's been known for at least 40 or 50 years. Though there's a kind of a famous paper. It's called Spence 1978. That's all about this question about how you understand rate regulation when what you care about is the price quality mix. But again, none of that's attended to here.
Yeah, but this goes to the issue of how badly Washington is screwing up this policy question by establishing a definition of broadband that is arbitrarily difficult to achieve.
Yes.
I mean, if the definition of broadband is going to be gigabit symmetrical service, you basically said, well, we're not going to compete on the basis of quality anymore. All the plans are going to be the same. Because if the minimum is symmetrical gigabit, there's really, what's the incentive to do, 10 gigabit symmetrical or whatever some future standard is when the floor is way beyond what the average consumer actually needs or uses today. So they've destroyed the dynamism in the market by setting a standard so high that competitors can't reach it, and it's completely meaningless to consumers.
Yeah,
because we know, the Starlink and 5G can achieve 200 to 300 megabits per second down and probably 30 or 40 up with latency between 5 and 45 milliseconds today. But the four senators that have written the symmetrical broadband bill and the other people that insist that broadband has to be symmetrical, even though utilization has never been and never will be.
Yeah, and yes. Utilization is like 95.5, right? It's usually 95 download, 5 upload, or something along those lines.
Yeah,
if you have symmetrical, that also means that you typically have a business service, an SLA, which you pay a lot of money for, which is something I really hate. That I shouldn't say hate, but I it really kind of irks me that a lot of journalists don't understand. When they go to these places that are getting, so I remember some conversation the Wall Street Journal had with this dentist, and the dentist was talking about, I can't believe I'm paying so much. My service, my dentist service with X, Y, and Z. And it clearly, to my mind, it's like, okay, that's going to require a business like an SLA, right? It's going to require a very sort of specific
service level agreement.
Yeah, service level agreement. I have to be always on at this level. I remember what we were paying at the time in DC for an SLA, and it was about the same thing that this guy was paying in rural Montana. And I'm like, well, wait a second. This is basically what you would expect. $1,500 a month we were paying like $1,200 a month for something in downtown DC because you needed a very dedicated, specific kind of business line. And to me, that there was a lot of mixing of services, and just it showed to somebody who's in the industry, or at least has been watching it for a very long time. And it just felt like outsiders talking about this. And that's oftentimes what I find is, it's like, well, wait a second, how much do you know about these, in your case, it's like the networks, like you're a network engineer. You've been doing this for years. And for me, I'm an economist, and I look at it and it's like, well, wait a second, how much do you know about economics and the changes that are required of economics, and really what you can say about how much can be changed, and your ability to change these prices if you are clearly showing you're not really addressing the major issues. You're not really trying to attend to the problems that exist, as we all know. It feels like outsiders talking about it, to be honest.
Well, I mean, and that is the problem now that this issue has become so completely political.
Mm-hmm.
There's the members of Congress and the executive branch are motivated to try to get that monopoly space in front of the TV cameras and be a champion for the cause of, broadband infrastructure improvement, but they haven't been part of the conversation. And as you pointed out, in some cases, don't even have the vocabulary.
Yeah.
And certainly haven't learned anything from the RDOF, from the experience of subsidy programs like RDOF and the the ones that the RUS has been operating to actually figure out where the bottlenecks are in getting these infrastructure upgrades deployed. So it actually, there is more to this than just talking. I mean, it does get down to concrete and steel and digging trenches and pulling cables and, designing network architectures and determining topologies and buying switches and 24/7 monitoring and dealing with problems that come up and correcting, downed wires that after high windstorms or snowstorms. I mean, it's not just, taking a place in the studio at CNN and letting rip with the talking points that your staff has prepared for you. I mean, they're really, they're just in different worlds. I mean, the people in the political world, they obviously understand the dynamics of appealing to voters.
Yeah.
And breaking issues down so that voters can understand them. But when it gets to the dynamics of vibrant marketplaces and effective deployment of upgrades and where the government can legitimately help, I think that, there's a pretty big gap in there.
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, the way that I would do this, I mean, if I had my druthers, the way that I would do this is, you need to redo the maps. I mean, I think that's pretty evidently clear that we're still kind of at a place where we don't have a great sense of what's going on locally. There's been a lot of efforts to this. I mean, I'm at Utah State now, and the state of Utah has been working on maps. So that's something that you need to do first and foremost, that I know is probably still coming in another, year or so. I think 2023 is at least the earliest that something like an updated map system would be available. So that really is the first thing you need to do. Then you would need to reestimate where the gaps are, right? So most of almost all of the estimates, and we're talking right now, I think about $60 billion as far as an estimate is concerned. Those estimates come from 2017. We haven't even really talked about this one singular white paper, which derives this entire conversation from 2017, based on 2015 data that is clearly outdated, right? We've had 6 years of advancements, and we're still, even our current data, I reran it, and it's something, I reran the numbers, and it's something like at least 5 or 6% off as far as the estimates of people who don't have broadband service. So those would need to be rerun.
Yeah, how much 5G and Starlink did we have back in 2015?
Zero, right? These services didn't exist at all. So then we would need to rerun that kind of cost estimate, or that cost gap, the availability gap. And then you'd want to very clearly target, as this white paper did. So the other part that I really hate that people don't seem to recognize within that white paper is, the author pointed out that about 2% of all services aren't going to be served because they have actual problems in maintaining the service in a day-to-day basis. Not even the initial service, not even the initial network, that their operational expenditures, their OpEx, is actually not going to be sufficient to maintain the network. So you have to figure out some system of support that way. And then
that's what Australia found out when they did their national broadband plan, that there were somewhere between 2 and 5% of the population of Australia that are never going to advance beyond geosynchronous satellites. That was it. That all the other alternatives were just hundreds, if not thousands of times too expensive to justify.
Yes. Even just operationally, right? You just can't you literally can't keep the lights on, even if you were to pay for all of the initial infrastructure. So then you would, and so after that process, after figuring out where the gaps are, the availability gaps, is then you'd want to clearly target it to those areas. It seems like RDOF has at least tried to go down that direction. There are concerns with RDOF, but again, money's still going out the door. It's not like that money isn't going out the door.
Right.
And so I think probably in another year or so, as you said, CenturyLink is the one of the big, so there's been two big criticisms of RDOF. One of the big criticism is wireless ISPs got way too much money. The other one has been that, traditional providers, including CenturyLink, that many in the industries have criticized for not doing the upgrades, also got a whole bunch of money. And so they are now doing these big fiber upgrades very, very clearly. There's a whole bunch of fiber being put into the ground in the next year and a half. And so that also seems to me, it's like, well, wait a second, let's let that at least be solved, or at least let's try to work through that. I mean, the best way that I would do this, is to have something that is effectively year over year, right? You have a much more solid program. It would look very similar to probably not the high cost fund, but it would mean a reform of universal service fund. It would mean that you were thinking about long term, and it wouldn't be this kind of one-time $60 billion sort of project. It would be a small dribble every single year in order to support very specific areas that need it, where there are clear gaps. And that takes more political energy, and it takes, it doesn't get votes. And they're really, I feel like people, we really don't talk about this as far as a long-term problem, something that can be solved not in the next year, but something that could be solved in the next 5 years if you had some heft behind it. But that's not being talked about, and we haven't even got into
there at least
the other issues as
there
well.
There are at least two different issues here. One of them is kind of what do we do? What do we want to do for long-term infrastructure support?
Exactly. Yeah.
Where we're talking about projects that probably aren't going to complete for 4 or 5 years in many cases. And even if we break out, the ones that we could do in a year, I mean, they probably each individual one could be done in a year if you had access to the labor and capital. But there's this long-term problem. Then there's a short-term problem of like, well, how do you get people connected today? And those are two different problems, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, thankfully, we finally, at least we're moving towards the broadband benefit, the emergency broadband benefit. Having something that's probably a little bit more permanent, that comes out of the general fund, that supports low income individuals in this, that gives them support to, gives them a some sort of supplement. You can do like an EITC, like, a tax credit of some sort at the end of the year. I mean, you could structure it a couple different ways, but that only now is happening. And it should have happened decades ago if we really care about getting people connected. That's probably the big thing you could do right now, is try to solve that cost problem. But there's this other relevancy issue, which I think is just going to be an unmovable object, that there is a very large portion of people in the United States who aren't connected because they don't want to be connected, that they have access to the internet. They are largely urban, but they are not going to consume it at any price. And no price inducements are going to change them either. And, that's about 2/3 of the market, maybe 70%. And you're just not going to be able to do anything about that.
There are people who just are never going to change. I mean, there are people who they could live to be 100 and they wouldn't. So look, I've never had that fancy internet in my trailer up to now. And so I don't need it. But, there are some people that are just incalcitrant. But I think the willingness, or the sort of the interest in broadband technology, is a lot stronger in your age group than it is in mine, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we created
and the
this
kind
stuff,
of consumption that we're using, I think, is very different. I mean, people younger than me don't really. I mean, I'm very surprised by there are some who program, but there seems to even be this knowledge gap between my. I'm really on the edge. As an older millennial, I'm on the edge between the two spaces. And I remember very well when the internet came about, right? I'm very cognizant of the commercialization of the internet. And I grew up programming in a way that even younger people, I mean, maybe I'm doing those kids sort of thing right now, but it seems to even be within millennials and Zoomers, there seems to be a very different experience, that millennials have, I think, a very different understanding of what the internet looks like than what Zoomers have.
Well, one of the things that happened in some of these East Asian countries that were held out as being the models for, perfect broadband infrastructure, Korea and Japan, with the advent of 4G, they started to lose subscribers to their fiber broadband service because the quality of the 4G was so good that, especially for the young people, they just didn't see any reason to have a separate, broadband plan at home that was wire based. I mean, they did all their internet stuff on their handheld device anyway, and the speeds were hundreds of megabits, and I don't know if they have data caps or not, but I mean, it just wasn't an issue. So they actually had to cut prices and everything to keep people from just leaving
Mm-hmm.
the fiber to the home system, basically in droves. I mean, this is one of the you give people the choice between everything else is equal and one service supports mobility and the other doesn't. Which one are you going to choose?
Yeah. And even if that's a minor change, even if that kind of pressure is a relatively minor pressure, that's still something that, that effectively with all of the evidence that the Biden administration has put out with their EO, that's something that given what they put out and given the studies that they've been referencing, that's not on their radar. This idea that there could even be this sort of competition is not on their radar. They're very much looking at old 1996 era competition issues and thinking about this as though the source of competition ultimately is the cable market with kind of the internet on the side instead of the internet market with the cable on the side. And those things, to me, it's like that flips change. It's changing, really. I mean, who knows exactly how it's changed? Because I don't think that there actually has been a lot of really good research that has shown this desire to change between the two. That actually is something that could be done by the administration. They could help support researchers.
I just don't think they're interested. I mean, they're.
I don't think so either.
Probably the most depressing thing I've heard, and there's been an awful lot of things that have depressed me in this dialogue about infrastructure, is the claim that, well, I mean, to me, and to you, I think, we understand that for poor people, this is a different problem than it is for rich people.
Yeah.
And and so the emergency broadband benefit's a great thing. It's getting a lot of people online, and there is going to be a need for permanent subsidies for low income individuals. They're people that can't pay the price, whatever it is. But their claim that if government providers are first in line for subsidy support over private sector providers, that will inherently lower the cost to the point where everyone can afford it. I mean, they've actually said that. Well, we don't really need ongoing subsidy programs if the networks are owned by government agencies. Well, the prices will just naturally go down, and it'll be affordable. And I don't even think Tim Wu believes that.
That's a striking change, because that is not. I mean, that is just so far afield of the way to do correct policy that I wouldn't be surprised, but that to me is not the way to do things. I mean, if you have a problem with price, you don't force the price. If the price itself is an output that is clearly caused because of local market issues, the way is not to just demand that service is provided at a lower price. What you do is you try to help people meet that price by supplementing their income, right? Like, because otherwise what you're effectively doing is just adding a tax onto. It's not really a tax. It's actually technically a price ceiling in local markets. And price ceilings have the effect exactly of doing the same thing as a tax, which is you create deadweight loss. And that to me is a really, really big problem. And the FCC tried to deal with it for years with their telephone pricing. I mean, this is the madness that came out of the 80s was right. Related to all these prices. And then, I don't know and that's not a really great history. I mean, you know this history better than anyone else. The outputs from those efforts to rate regulate were not, they were really not that great. I mean, there's still some controversy over it, but it just doesn't seem like it did anything all that great. It really doesn't seem like it actually embedded competition. Didn't seem like it created new competitors. That was another idea, to create new competitors in each of these cases. And it just didn't have the kind of big, bold benefits that people were proclaiming. And yet we're about to do it again.
We just don't learn. I mean, we
Apparently
don't
not.
learn. I mean, the lessons that people live in are so cabined in the policy world and the political. Well, the interface between the world of politics and the world of policy, it's just not permeable enough, and so these lessons just don't go from one sphere to the other. Well, for a 30-minute podcast, well, we did pretty well. It's been about an hour and a half now. So I guess I budget time like the federal government. I mean,
just let it keep on rolling, huh? It's always great to talk to you, Richard. I mean, it's always it's great to talk with somebody who gets these issues, because oftentimes I'm just bashing my head against the wall when just really basic things just seem to be lost on folks. And I don't mind, having these conversations. I have students that I have these conversations and try to explain these things every day. But when you're having to do this in front of legislators and staffers, it is, I love doing it because I know a lot of people don't really have, this is a very esoteric area. But I should say it this way, when I talk to people who clearly should know better, when I talk to law professors and people who are trying to be advisors in this space and clearly aren't really dealing with the issues as they exist, that to me is it's a very maddening place to be, because I feel like we're not playing the same game.
Yeah, I mean, I think mostly people who work in public policy, I think, mean well and want good outcomes.
Yes.
And obviously there's always going to be differences of opinion about how best to achieve the outcomes. But then, when it all becomes political, then none of that really seems to matter. It's just a question of what's going to create the most outrage and it's sort of like Facebook. I mean, it all becomes about engagement and emotion and output. And it's just a shame that people can't kind of take a step back and just reflect on calmly and peacefully about how complicated the problem is and what's likely to get us where we need to go and what kind of measurements we're going to have to take along the way to ensure that we're actually on the road and not off in the weeds. So
I would love to come back and talk about that, because our experimental lab just came out with new research on engagement and misinformation and fake news. So
those are my favorite subjects.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, I mean, but at the risk of making a long conversation longer, I really find like there's one of the movements I study is the anti-vaccine movement.
Oh yeah.
And so there's, in vaccines, there's this thing called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is every country has one of these. And so any kind of an adverse health outcome that takes place after someone has been vaccinated for anything gets reported into this database. I mean, not always, but I mean, it's there for that purpose. And so a report into this database doesn't establish causality. It just means, so grandpa got his Pfizer shot in December, and in May he passed away. And of course, it doesn't say that the death was caused by the vaccine. It just simply followed it. So it's not causation, it's correlation. And so these are to tip off researchers so they know, well, maybe we should go investigate. There more grandpas than usual have died over this time, and after they were vaccinated, we should go find out if there's really something going on there, or if it's just the base rate of mortality. I see a lot of the same kind of reasoning in our Achania papers, like, well, prices are higher. I mean, speeds are lower over here, and so it's correlation and causation. We're not going to try to figure out why speeds are lower in the rural areas. We just take that as, well, it must be because of competition, because competition is the only thing that causes anything. Just like once you've been vaccinated, the vaccine is responsible for every aspect of your health for the rest of your life, right? And so if I get vaccinated and then I have a car wreck, well, it must be that, the vaccine caused that, right? Made me a worse driver. So it's just like you need investigation. You need to be able to analyze things. You need to be able to build models, and most importantly, you need to be able to test your models to make sure they're accurately predicting what's going on.
Yeah.
But
the other big thing is, as you mentioned, is whether or not all of that competition actually leads to something that is, or that lack of competition, or the price quality mix actually leads to something that is detrimental to people. I mean, the big thing from that paper is that competition, basically that there can be more social benefits through increased access to these services, but it's also it's going the wrong way, right? That's always the question about these correlation causation problems, which we have to be very, very clear about. And, there's ways to deal with it. But the question is, of course, whether or not the monopoly is there because there isn't the demand for these services, or the other way around, right? These things run in tandem. And so you have to use more advanced techniques to figure out if and when the two things and how they're related. And that to me is that really, it's good science. And it is kind of self-evident for people who work in this space as economists, but not necessarily for an attorney.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out the argument that we'll get better consumer welfare if we don't think about consumer welfare. that one, to me, like you want to look at it and measure it and stuff, and but anyway, I'm not an economist. So thanks so much, Will Rinehart, for joining us on the High Tech Forum podcast, episode 59, to talk about the quirks of the current discussion around broadband infrastructure. We do these podcasts on a fairly idiosyncratic time separation. So, just and you can subscribe through iTunes and the other places that you get podcasts. So just, if you liked what you heard, sign up and, leave us some comments, and you'll get notified the next time we do one. So thanks so much, Will, for taking part.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Richard Bennett signing off.